research, I looked at the role of oral Torah in the teachings of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. Quick bio of Nachman of Breslov, he's a Hasidic master in the early Hasidic tradition. He was born in 1772 and died in 1810, so he died very young, 38. But he was prolific during his career. He actually didn't write anything down, but his sermons they delivered orally, usually on Rosh Hashanah and Shavuos mostly, were recorded in a book called Likutei Moharan by his primary student, Reb Nosson, the first volume of which was published in his lifetime in 1808, and the second volume in 1812 when he'd already died. There's a collection of homilies, so it's highly associative, associating things which you wouldn't necessarily think were associated, kind of homilies of verses, dealing with traditional rabbinic sources, source of Jewish mysticism. But anyways, he receives this particular tradition from the Kabbalah, the Jewish mysticism, that oral Torah, Torah Shebaal Peh, is feminine, right?
Why is that?
So yes, it's a great question. In the Zohar, it already says, Malchut, which is a certain sphera, a certain emanation of God, which is a feminine one, is associated with Torah Shebaal Peh, right? There's a deep connection between the feminine and the mouth, and that has to do with sovereignty. A lot to get into. And it's not only kind of abstractly feminine, but it's also associated with Eve, with Lilith, which is kind of the she-demon, like the counterpart of Eve. Lilith actually is the same gematria as Talmud, so there's that kind of connection. And then Rachel also is connected with the oral Torah. It's interesting.
As opposed to Leah or Rivka,
Yeah. So there's one which is like Rachel, like a sheep, right? That there's kind of like the taking of wool is like everyone contributing to the Torah Shebaal Peh, kind of taking a piece off, and there's like kind of a communal contribution and association with this one central figure. But there are a lot of associations with Rachel, which are varied. But like a lot of things, the written Torah, right, the revealed Torah isn't complete until it's joined. This is my professor Mason. But the written Torah isn't complete until it's joined by the kind of the feminine counterpart, right? There's a very classical mystical idea that like the divine masculine needs the divine feminine, but then once it's combined, it kind of gets subsumed into a oneness. So that's in and of itself kind of a radical notion that the written Torah is insufficient in and of itself, that it needs this complement of orality, of this oral tradition. And that's feminine is also an interesting component of that. And there's this kind of esoteric element to it as well, right? That in the Talmud it says that oral Torah can't be written down, which obviously wasn't, they eventually wrote down the Talmud, but how Nachman kind of reinterprets it is there are certain teachings which ought to be kept oral and kind of esoteric, right? If you're not in kind of this group of students, you shouldn't have access to these teachings through the text because the text allows them to be kind of misconstrued and misappropriated, right? Which leads into kind of oral Torah as the embodiment of Jewish particularism. That there's this notion that when God gave the written Torah, it was susceptible to be copied by the nations of the world, right? And other nations have copied the kind of Hebrew Bibles. There's a historical back to that. But oral tradition, why it was not supposed to be written down, was so that it couldn't be copied, right? You needed to be internal to the system in order to access it, and therefore it can't be misappropriated, right? Which is also this idea of the esoteric nature of oral Torah. And given that the oral Torah was only given as the exclusive property of the Jewish people, therefore there's kind of this essentialized aspect that the oral Torah exists within the Jewish people. It's kind of part of their composition, part of their nature. That like the participation in the tradition is something that's essential to their character. And this leads to this kind of striking image, because it's about Jewish unity and Jewish particularism. There are these images, for instance, that Rabbi Nachman suggests that when a Tana creates a chiddush, an innovation, and then a later generation learns that chiddush, it's as if the person learning it is kissing the Tana. Right? He even says that there's almost like sexual intercourse through the teaching between these two men, which is a really interesting depiction.
That comes from the Likutei Moharan?
Yes, these are basically all from Rabbi Nachman's writing in Likutei Moharan.
Likutei Moharan is Nachman.
Exactly.
He's a student.
Right. Moharan is just Morenu Harav Rabbi Nachman. And so
Maybe it's Nosson.
maybe. Hard to say. And yeah, so this image is very striking, right? This interchange of breath through the kiss that is learning, and I think that part of it is he's acknowledging kind of the homoeroticism of the Beit Midrash, of the tradition of learning, right? These men engaging with each other all day, no women around, right? And what kind of makes it palatable for them is that they're engaging with this feminized other, right? They're not kissing each other; they're kind of kissing through this feminized other, which makes it a little bit more legitimate.
The other being Torah Shabbat Peh.
Exactly.
And there's a back and forth.
They're both kind of engaging with Torah Shabbat, which is also the Shekhinah, right? Everyone's concerned about this feminized other, but they're all engaging with each other through them. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic there.
Maybe even chasing it.
Exactly, for sure. I was just talking with my professor. There's this notion of like the kind of an erotic element of the Torah, which is like revealing and covering and revealing. There's this kind of like there is an erotic imagery to that, which is like it's all about
Mystery.
the pursuit. Yeah.
Pursuit and mystery.
Seduction.
Exactly. And also it's important to remember the whole Kabbalistic framework of Judaism is that the point of mitzvot, the point of observance, is to unite the feminine and the masculine parts of the Godhead, right? The rupture between the Shekhinah and God, right? Putting those together. So it's all about these kind of dynamics of combining the feminine with the masculine. Right, so then there's this kind of fraught nature as well to Torah Shabbat Peh, because it's created through machloka, right? It's created through debate, and the way that Nachman phrases that is that when someone begins to engage with oral Torah, the only way you can begin and not just accept the tradition is you need to lose emunat chachamim. You need to lose your faith in the sages, right? And once you've lost faith in the sages, then you begin to look. Okay, well, what are they saying? Let me look into this, right? And you begin to look into it for yourself. And slowly through that process, you kind of build back this faith and authority, right? Once you've tracked all these different debates. And that's kind of how one becomes personally invested, is they lose faith in the sages and the authority, and they need to do it for themselves, and then at the end they regain this kind of faith. And all the books that they had previously dismissed, they had said, what are these teachings? They come to be again for them, right? And like that's the process of forming books, is re-acknowledging the legitimacy of these teachings. But the fact that the oral Torah is created through debate and through conflict makes it kind of fraught, right? It has its roots in this fraught nature, and therefore it can be either used for kind of extreme good or extreme bad, right? I'm sure you've heard of the tradition that like if you're learning oral Torah you can't die, right? That's something that comes up in the Gemara. Rabbi Nachman says, true that if you're learning it you can't die, but if you're learning it improperly, right, either to be arrogant, to get a title for yourself, or to antagonize other people, the more you know, the better you can antagonize other people. If you're doing it like that, you actually help the Malach HaMavet. So you increase the force of evil, right?
So what's your assessment on that statement of the Gemara, which is clearly not factually correct? Is it
Right.
like hyperbole? Is it trying to, some other meaning? Why say that?
Yeah, so I mean, in the Gemara, that's in its own context. I think there's kind of a mystical idea, right? They have these priorities. All these teachings are not just kind of theology. They're not just kind of philosophy. They're also trying to inspire people to live a certain way, right? And so if the idea is that you're engaging with these texts that they've understood as holy and good, right? There's the notion that it wards off evil is like a motivating factor, right? But it's acknowledging the fact that you have to do it properly, right? If you're just doing it to be a jerk and to be arrogant and say obviously this is a local criticism of the opponents of Hasidism, who are these misnagdim, who are learning to as a status thing, an elitism, right? And saying I'm so much better. He's saying that's actually counterproductive, right? That's increasing the force of evil, and he tracks that to right, and that's the notion of Lilith, right? That like Eve is kind of the ideal feminization, and then Lilith is kind of the opposite of that, right? And the Torah Shabbat Peh, the oral Torah,
Could be both.
Could be either. It's very volatile, right? And that's why, and this is true of Malchut in general, right? That it can be corrupted, right? The Shekhinah can be corrupted, right? But it can also be redeemed.
Is Kabbalah considered Torah Shabbat Peh?
Yes, that's a great question. I think
Mysticism?
especially because he's reframing it as kind of oral Torah as kind of this esoteric pursuit. In that definition, it's kind of essential to
Anything that comes after, really.
everything that comes after.
Out
It's
of
all
the mouth of the rabbis.
exactly, and especially because none of Kabbalah was written down, right? They
So even more so.
Luria said, I don't want any of my teachings
When
written
did it
down.
originate, do you think? Zohar and
The
Kabbalah?
Zohar, I think, is in the 15th century, but there's always been kind of a mystical tradition, already from the time of the 5th century, the Amoraim, that even the Tanaim had, like, they're mystical, framing it as Kabbalah, a difficult question, but, like, there's always been a mystical
Can I ask you a
aspect.
question?
Yeah.
Because one thing I love about your studies is that you have comparative, like you're gonna compare these thoughts to the broader world. Did Judaism or the rabbis copy, improve, or innovate mysticism and Kabbalah?
I mean, I think all Jewish Kabbalah has a certain its roots are in Neoplatonism, right? Like they're all, like the people who are writing this Kabbalistic tradition were inspired by Neoplatonism and writings of Aristotle and whatever. Even though they might formally deny it, there's definitely an influence. And also Abu Lafia, who was kind of an early North African Kabbalist, he was very inspired by Sufism. Sufism kind of made its way, the kind of Muslim mystical tradition made its way into the Jewish mystical tradition through him.
Would you find similar? Would the Sufi version of Sam in Ashbahad kind of touch on a lot of these with a similar Muslim Rav Nachman, or has Judaism or your thoughts really branched out separately?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that the thing that's really, really specific about like Kabbalism, like Kabbalah and mysticism in general in Judaism, is it's very particular. It's all about the mitzvot, right? The commandments, you can't translate that, right? You can't say the kavanot on the lulav, right? The specific intentions you need to have over the lulav. There's no way to translate that to another tradition, right? It's there are ideas that obviously are comparable, but the focus, the exclusive focus on the very particular Jewish tradition has made it, there are differences. It's a particularist tradition.
I don't know if I like that example because of Palm Sunday, I've always seen that there are ties to that.
Right.
They have their own mitzvot, right?
Right. But just to say, what's happening specifically with tzitzit, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Okay.
It's obviously everything can be compared, but and then kind of the last move here is that the Nachman makes kind of a historical claim that the Baal Shem Tov, kind of one of the founders of Chassidism, he died because of a corruption of the oral Torah. That the Frankists and Shabtai Tzvi kind of came from within the tradition, from within the oral tradition, and they left and corrupted it, right? And there's kind of more power to do damage to the internal community when something that is internal has been brought out.
Is that a physical claim that he got killed by those, or just?
Yeah, he says,
he got killed by someone who was a shopkeeper.
No, it's
no,
always
he had
been
2 holes in his heart because
But
of
because the Baal Shem Tov, or who was it that had endorsed the Shabtai Tzvi, and he paid for that? Somebody famous endorsed him.
I think he preceded the Baal Shem Tov, right?
Yeah.
That's what I would think. But there's somebody else
he was
around
more
the same time.
around the time of the
Rabbi
Frankists.
Akiva?
No, that was
way.
Okay, sorry.
You think about Kafka.
Yeah. But yeah, the Frankists were burning the Talmud around this time, but there's this kind of the assault on Torah Shabbat Pez, an assault on Jews at large, right? Because it's something internal, because it's something particular, because it's something essentialized, right? And because it's so fraught, and so if you bring it out, it has this power to kind of corrupt and attack.
Lubavitch Rebbe used to say that his heart attack came from Israel's law of return that did not follow halacha. So I guess that's a
right.
That's a yes. He's
Right.
just following.
Following his heart.
Right.
It's difficult when something from within the tradition comes and
Yes. Israel for him was special, but yet it was undermining halacha.
Exactly.
That's a good point.
yeah. So
Yeah,
that's my presentation.
Awesome.
Mazel tov.
Thank you.
We love